how did this happen? Okay. The first thing you have to understand, and it's very important to understanding the European, especially the European Commission and the German view, is that this was never supposed to happen. This mess that Greece has an enormous debt that most people think is unpayable cannot happen. The Maastricht Treaty, that's an international treaty that was signed between all the members of, it was then the European Community, that settled on the details for EMU, that created it in the early 1990s. And one of the articles that everyone signed, including Greece, but also Germany, is I'll read it out because it's important. Neither the community, it was the European Community, nor any member state is liable for or can assume the commitments of any other member state. Okay. That is a constitutional treaty that says you cannot bail out Greece or anyone else. It is illegal for Germany or anyone else to transfer money to Greece to pay off its debt. The spirit of the treaty has been violated, of the Maastricht Treaty. Okay, and there are all these European bailout mechanisms that have been evolved. So I'll just list them very briefly to make sure that you're aware of how many there are. This crisis started in some sense in 2009. There was a big deal in May of 2010. And at that point, they created what's known as the EFSM, the European Financial Stabilization Mechanism. That was 60 billion. Okay. Then they created another one at the same time, the European Financial Stability Facility, the EFSF, okay, May 2010. And that has the capacity to issue bonds, okay, for on the order of €500 billion, okay? And so the total limit is 440 with 60 billion from the EFSM. Both of these things were not supposed to exist at all under the terms of the Maastricht Treaty because they're bailout mechanisms, which are illegal, okay? And the terms that they wrote was that we will essentially bail out temporarily another member of Europe if there is lending with conditionality. And who's in charge of the conditionality? This group called the Troika, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF. So the basic deal is if Greece or anyone else wants to take advantage of these bailout mechanisms, which aren't supposed to exist, okay, they can do so, but only with the agreement from these three institutions, the IMF, the European Commission, and the European Central Bank, the so-called Troika. Okay. And that's the thing that the Greeks really hate, because they have outsiders coming in to say, are you doing what you agreed to do when we agreed to bail you out? And what the terms of the bailout program are things like raising taxes on various things, cutting down on tax evasion, cutting pensions, cutting spending, firing civil servants, all that sort of stuff, austerity. Okay. But that didn't work alone. Okay, so Greece got a bailout package from them. Ireland and Portugal followed, but that wasn't viewed as sufficiently big. So there's this other one called the European Stability Mechanism. That was a permanent fund. That's another $500 billion. That was started a couple of years later because the European crisis dragged on. Okay, there's another one, the European Monetary Fund, that also started a couple of years later. Then there's, the last one is banking union. Okay, so these are all mechanisms to try and deal with the Greek crisis. The banking union started less than a year ago. So there's a single supervisor for all European banks, at least the large ones, which is the European Central Bank. So these are all essentially bailout institutions that have been created over the last 5 years. The details are unimportant. What's relevant is that these are institutions that really shouldn't exist, that weren't supposed to be there, that have been created to deal with the Greek crisis as it lurches on from one inadequate response to another inadequate response. Now, they allowed themselves some wiggle rooms, what economists like to call escape clauses, which is, we will ignore one of these criteria if you give us a really plausible reason. Okay, so in practice, okay, Italy had a debt to GDP ratio of over 120%, and everyone said, well, we've got to have pasta in the EMU, that we're just going to ignore that. Belgium had a debt to GDP ratio of well over 120%. But you can't have a European anything without Belgium in it, because that's where Brussels is, right? So, and so Belgium still has a debt to GDP ratio in excess of 100%. Greece had a debt to GDP ratio of well in excess of 60, over 100 percentage points of GDP, and they just ignore it. Okay, so this is applied by politicians. But the main focus was not on the stock one, it was on the first one, the flow, the deficit to GDP ratio. And lo and behold, when the time came for Greece to be considered seriously, they just hit 3.0000, okay? And then a couple of years later, it was officially announced that they had to restate their national accounts, okay? So there's no doubt in anyone's mind that they lied their way in. They never hit 3%. And that is one of the continuing sources of anger for the Germans. Not just the Germans, that they never hit 3%. But still, Greece is over 3% when the crisis starts in 2010. So there is more pressure for fiscal austerity, okay? And that is the issue that is going on through the present day. So yesterday in Riga, there was considerable pressure by all members of the Troika, the fund, the European Central Bank, and especially the European Commission, all the rest of Europe, for Greece to continue reform. So what is reform? Raise those taxes, cut down on tax evasion, cut government spending, cut especially pension reform is considered to be a big thing. Greece has way too many labor markets that are rigid. You've got to reduce those, reduce the size of the social security net, and so forth. And that's why there is pressure on Greece that continues through the present day for fiscal austerity. And it's not just Greece. Okay, let me just say in passing, Portugal, Spain, Ireland, Italy, and so forth, they're also experiencing the same thing. Okay, so that's essentially where we are today. Okay, so the question is, will this work? The markets right now aren't panicked. And again, the primary exhibit in favor of that is the fact that the bond rate is only 13%. Okay, many people like me, many commentators, okay, agree with the markets. Some people disagree. Okay, what I want to deal with now is, should you be thinking about this problem this way at all? How should you think about EMU at all? Is this the right way to think about the problems that are affecting Greece? And the answer is going to be no. Okay. So how should you think about EMU? Okay. Economists, and I will say, and you should be able to verify this if you've taken a class from me, our MBA students ask different questions about EMU. Okay. And the most important one, and certainly one that we try to drill into everyone, is the big question is, do European countries look like what's called an optimum currency area? An area which should have one currency. Should Greece be using the same currency as Germany, as France, as the Netherlands, as Spain? When are two regions, and they don't have to be from the same country, they can be two different countries, when are two regions likely to gain from using one money? Okay, and here's the answer. There are two parts to it. If they share deep trade links, that's one part. That's a necessary but not sufficient condition, okay? If two areas share a lot of trade, they do a lot of trade between them, then they gain from using one currency. Here's the other one. If they share the same business cycles, that's the other part. So for two regions to gain from using the same money, they have to engage in lots of trade, and they have to have the same business cycles. So the idea is, when one region is doing well, okay, and probably needs tighter interest rates to sort of squelch down the economy and prevent it from overheating, if the other one needs a boost, they need very different monetary policies. They probably can't get along together in using one money. But if when California is doing well, Nevada is also doing well, and so they both need tighter money, higher interest rates to sort of damp down inflationary pressures, then things are going to work well. So Mundell's idea is there are two important things that you have to have for two regions of any size to gain from using the same money: lots of trade and similar business cycles. If they have very different business cycles, and one needs a low interest rate when the other one needs a high interest rate, you've got some serious problems. So what's the idea of Mundell's optimum currency area? He says the following. Suppose that two regions have fundamentally different business cycles, asymmetric business cycles, and there's little risk sharing, okay, and immobile labor. So there's no system of taxes and transfers, and there's immobile labor. Then the syllogism goes, 3, you gain from having different monies. So Finland could have a very loose monetary policy. Germany could have a very tight monetary policy that could alleviate the unemployment in Finland and the inflation in Germany. Everyone gains. Okay? So you want different monies, okay, when you have asymmetric business cycles and neither risk sharing nor mobile labor. Okay. Think about Europe on the other hand. Okay? Greece has been in recession on and off for 5 years. Same thing is true of Portugal. Same thing is true to a first approximation of Spain, of Italy, of Ireland. So there are some areas that are doing very poorly. There are some areas that are doing really well. Call that Germany. Okay? Big asymmetries. Big asymmetries. Okay? Is there a system of risk sharing? Well, the European Commission has a budget for all of the 28 countries that are in the European Union. It's small, on the order of 1.3 percentage points of GDP. That's on the order of 15 times less than the American federal government. So it's small, and almost none of that is discretionary because they waste most of it through common agricultural policy. Okay? So there is no system of risk sharing. Is labor mobile? Okay, well, remember, unemployment rates exceed 25% in Spain and Greece now. In principle, they could move to Germany, but they don't. Now, we don't know whether it's linguistic or legal stuff or housing or family or purely cultural, but we know in practice, unemployed people in the south of Europe simply don't move to Germany. Okay, so Europe has asymmetric business cycles, no system of risk sharing, okay, and immobile labor. So Europe does not look like an optimum currency area. The end. That is the easiest and most effective, and certainly the most economically grounded way to think about what's happening in Europe right now. EMU, in some sense, was doomed from the start. It was not well designed. It is not an optimal currency area. So what's my bottom line? It is true that Greece has a fiscal problem. They have way too much debt, okay? They're not going to be able to pay it all off. But even if they could, okay, which I think is politically impossible at this point, even if they could, that wouldn't restore growth, okay? It is very difficult for them right now, after 5 years of really slow growth, and they're probably in recession again now. It is very difficult for them to maintain high taxes and to keep on cutting government services, especially after a new government was elected to reverse this. Okay, so I think that that's essentially politically impossible to solve their fiscal problem, but even if they could, it wouldn't reduce the competitiveness problem. The real problem is that they have poor competitiveness compared with Germany, as does Italy, as does Spain, as does Portugal. Okay? So there are bubble overhangs, there was overbuilding in Greece and in the rest of the southern periphery that didn't occur in Germany. Okay? And as a result, okay, because they're not part of an optimum currency area, they have no way to respond to this asymmetric shock within EMU. And there is just no easy solution for that. EMU was poorly designed, okay? Sooner or later, this was going to appear. So my view is that a more serious crisis, the breakup of EMU sooner or later, is inevitable. Okay. Now, when that takes place, okay, some people think it's not going to be a big deal. Now, that was also true before Lehman Brothers went under. Okay, so Lehman Brothers, don't forget, was the smallest of the investment banks. People knew it was on the rocks, and people thought, well, look, we have to let one of the investment banks go under to make sure that everyone knows that the rules of the game are tough, okay? That we are not going to bail out everyone. That was the view before Lehman Brothers, and the markets anticipated it's not going to be a big deal. Greece, okay, is a country, not a small investment bank, and there have been international efforts for 5 years now to keep it afloat. So I think this could easily be way worse than Lehman Brothers. Okay, so that is why I think a financial crisis here is inevitable. I don't know what form it will take. Okay, but sooner or later, this is going to come up, and it will probably be sooner.